Introduction to GDPR. Introduction to the module. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is one of the most comprehensive data privacy laws in the world, setting a global standard for data protection. Non-compliance can result in significant penalties. This module will introduce you to the key aspects of the GDPR, including its history, scope, and the obligations it imposes on organizations. By understanding these fundamentals, you will be better equipped to ensure compliance and protect personal data within your organization. Learning objectives. By the end of this module, you will be able to describe the concept of the General Data Protection Regulation, understand the history and purpose of the GDPR, determine the personal and territorial scope of the GDPR, define commonly used terms in the GDPR. Overview of the GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, took effect on May 25, 2018, replacing the European Union's Data Protection Directive, DPD, of 1995. It is the most stringent privacy and security law in the world. Though it was drafted and passed by the European Union, EU, it puts duties on organizations wherever, as long as they target or collect data about EU citizens. The GDPR will impose heavy fines on those who break its privacy and security regulations, with penalties ranging in the tens of millions of euros. The GDPR signals Europe's hard stance on data privacy and security at a time when more individuals are committing their personal data to cloud services, and breaches are commonplace. GDPR compliance is a frightening prospect, especially for small and medium-sized organizations, SMEs, due to the regulation's scale, breadth, and relative lack of specificity. Cases in which the regulation applies. This regulation applies to the processing of personal data fully or partly by automated means, as well as the processing other than by automated means of personal data that constitute part of a filing system or are intended to form part of a filing system. Individuals to whom the regulation applies. The GDPR applies to individuals who process or control personal data. The GDPR will have a significant impact on companies due to the economic value of data. The legal form of an entity is immaterial, allowing for a wide range of standard addressees. The GDPR assigns various duties and responsibilities for data security to those within its scope. To assess the GDPR's personal scope of application and data protection responsibilities, it is necessary to identify who is a controller, a processor, and who benefits from data protection. Where the regulation applies. This regulation applies to the processing of personal data in the context of the activities of a controller or processor based in the Union, regardless of whether the processing takes place inside or outside of the Union. Furthermore, this regulation applies to the processing of personal data of Union data subjects by non-Union controllers or processors for the following purposes. A. Offering goods or services to Union data subjects without requiring payment, or B. Monitoring their behavior within the Union. This regulation also applies to personal data processing by a controller not based in the Union, but at a location where member state law applies under public international law. History of GDPR. The right to privacy is a component of the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights, which stipulates that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. On this premise, the European Union has moved to preserve this right through legislation. As technology advanced and the Internet emerged, the EU recognized the need for updated safeguards. So, in 1995, it enacted the European Data Protection Directive, which established basic data privacy and security criteria on which each member state developed its own implementing legislation. However, the Internet was already evolving into the data host it is today. The first banner advertisement emerged on the Internet in 1994. In 2000, the majority of financial institutions provided Internet banking. Facebook had its public debut in 2006. In 2011, a Google user sued the corporation after it scanned her emails. 2 months later, Europe's data protection body concluded that the EU required a comprehensive approach to personal data protection and began work to revise the 1995 regulation. The GDPR went into effect in 2016 after passing through the European Parliament, and as of May 25, 2018, all organizations were expected to be compliant. Aims of GDPR. The DPD was in force for 20 years and established a minimum standard for data protection regulation in EU member states. Many states went significantly further in terms of legislating to protect personally identifiable information, PII, making it increasingly difficult for EU residents to understand how their rights were protected across the EU and for businesses to determine which set of laws they should follow, especially when trading across multiple member states. The European Commission opted for a unitary regulation to achieve two main objectives. 1. Protecting the rights, privacy, and freedoms of individuals in the EU. 2. Reducing commercial barriers by enabling the free movement of data across the EU. In terms of EU legislation, a regulation differs from a directive, which was how data protection was handled under the DPD. While directives establish minimal requirements and then request that EU member states supply their own legislation to satisfy those criteria, regulations exist as laws themselves, surpassing any applicable laws issued by member states. Scope of the GDPR. The GDPR applies both a material and a territorial scope. These are the uses of personal data and geographical locations covered by the regulation. Material scope of GDPR. In its broadest sense, the GDPR applies to the processing of personal data fully or partly by automated means, as well as the processing other than by automated means of personal data that constitute part of a filing system or are intended to form part of a filing system. A filing system organizes personal data for easy access and use. This might range from an alphabetized bundle of papers in a cabinet to a large searchable database. Emails in an inbox are more likely to qualify than a box of documents in a backroom. Exemptions to the material scope include non-EU activities for national security, member state activities related to EU foreign and security policy, personal or household processing, and competent authorities in member states for crime and security, for example, police. So, this is already pretty wide, and every company that uses personal data in any way will most likely be forced to comply with the regulation. Territorial scope of GDPR. The territorial scope is equally vast, raising a number of additional difficulties for organizations outside the EU as well as those within the EU doing business with organizations outside. The regulation applies under three territorial criteria. 1. Organizations within the EU that process personal data, even if the actual processing takes place outside the EU. 2. Organizations outside the EU that process personal data of EU residents in order to provide goods or services to the EU or to monitor EU residents' activity. 3. Organizations outside the EU that are otherwise subject to EU legislation but operate under public international law. The second of these is obviously troublesome. In simple terms, it will apply to any organization that provides processing services to another organization within the EU, as well as any organization that plainly offers goods and/or services into the EU. For example, if you sell things and your website specifies prices in euros, you are plainly selling to the EU and must comply with the GDPR. If you own a hotel in Australia and do not market it in the EU, the personal data of any EU residents who stay with you is excluded from the regulation. The scope of the GDPR is obviously a difficult topic, and it influences how you should structure your compliance efforts, particularly if you have a long or intricate supply chain. Key terminologies. The manual uses several key terms, each with a distinct definition. These definitions are based on the GDPR. Article 4 of the GDPR outlines crucial definitions that require rigorous study. However, the regulation includes a few universally applicable terms that must be grasped from the beginning. For example, processing. Processing refers to any automated or manual operation of personal data, including collection, recording, organization, structuring, storage, adaptation, alteration, retrieval, consultation, use, disclosure, alignment, erasure, and destruction. Controller. The term controller refers to an individual, public authority, agency, or other body that determines the purpose and means of processing personal data. If union or member state law determines the purposes and means of processing, the controller or specific criteria for its nomination may be specified. Processor. The term processor refers to any individual or entity that handles personal data on behalf of the controller. Personal data. Personal data refers to information about an identifiable natural person, data subject. An identifiable natural person can be identified through an identifier such as a name, identification number, location data, online identifier, or factors related to their physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity. Data subject. The individual whose data is processed. These are your clients or website visitors. Supervisory authority. A supervisory authority refers to an independent public authority formed by a member state. The supervisory authority is the governmental organization in each member state responsible for the enforcement of the GDPR. Highlights from this module. The GDPR is a comprehensive data privacy law that took effect on May 25, 2018. It applies to organizations both within and outside the EU that process the personal data of EU residents. The GDPR replaced the 1995 Data Protection Directive to enhance data protection across the EU. Key roles under the GDPR include data controllers and data processors. The regulation enforces strict guidelines on the processing of personal data, with an emphasis on protecting individual rights. Thank you. This is the end of this module. Hope it was a great learning experience for you. See you in the next module.